Japan's great carriers were destroyed.
On board the 3 Japanese carriers, there was chaos. Aircraft, fuel tanks and ammunition exploded, sending fireballs and huge chunks of metal flying through the air. All 3 carriers were turned into flaming wrecks. Many of their crews suffocating in the smoke, trapped below decks that glowed red hot.
A gush of hot air washed over me. We were hit hard. As fire spread, heaps of bombs began to explode with shattering blasts. I could see, not far off, the Akagi and the Soryu. They too are aflame. It was a terrible scene.
Nagumo survived the attack on the Akagi, but was forced to abandon his burning flagship. In little more than 5 minutes, the Americans had struck 3 times into the heart of the Imperial Japanese Navy at its moment of maximum vulnerability. But all was not lost for the Japanese. The 4th Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, was untouched. And now, 18 dive bombers and 6 Zeros from this one surviving Japanese carrier were sent to search out and destroy the American ships. They were amongst the last remnants of Nagumo's huge force, but these few Japanese pilots were deadly professionals, unlikely to miss their targets.
Intent on revenge, the pilots from the Hiryu soon spotted what they were looking for. An enemy carrier. It was the USS Yorktown.
The crew of the Yorktown were horrified to see the Japanese bombers approaching. They'd been hit by the Japanese before at the Battle of the Coral Sea, but this time they were prepared. The experience of the Coral Sea had taught them vital lessons in damage control, which they immediately put into action.
The 5-inch guns opened up first with loud cracks. Then came the rumble of multiple guns. The enemy bombers and fighters were under intense anti-aircraft fire from all the automatic weapons. The sky was black from shell bursts. Red tracers laced the sky. Japanese planes were falling, trailing fire, exploding as they hit the water.
Anti-aircraft guns put up an effective barrage which destroyed many of the approaching Japanese planes. But 7 of the bombers made it through. They dodged the wall of flak coming from the carrier and dropped their bombs. They scored 3 direct hits. The bombs ripped through the flight deck and exploded deep in the heart of the ship, snuffing out the boilers. The Yorktown slowed to a halt.
It seemed like it was all over for the Yorktown.
But the Yorktown's crew were not going to give up that easily. Deep below decks, the engineers struggled to get the ship going again. But the boilers were wrecked. Thick black smoke poured into the intense heat of the engine room, choking the men. For over an hour, they worked against the odds, fixing the boilers. And by about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the Yorktown was operational again, making about 20 knots.
Reports from their pilots that an enemy carrier had been destroyed began to revive Japanese hopes. A second attack force was quickly launched from the Hiryu to find and destroy another of the American carriers.
At 2:40, the Hiryu's second strike force arrived and launched another devastating attack on the Yorktown. The mighty ship had taken all that she could, and soon she was listing to port. Her crew had to abandon ship.
The Battle of Midway was now to end with one final act of destruction. The Japanese believed they'd sunk 2 of the 3 US carriers. They didn't realize they'd hit the Yorktown twice. They now thought that they were fighting on equal terms with the Americans, with just 1 surviving carrier each. Based on this misapprehension, the commanders on the Hiryu now made an almost unbelievable decision. For the next 90 minutes, the battle would be put on hold.
The surviving Japanese pilots on the Hiryu had been up since before dawn, and they were exhausted by the day's constant flight operations. They were barely able to function. So now that it was thought there was only 1 remaining American aircraft carrier left to sink, the men were told that they had time to take a rest and grab a bite to eat. It was a final, fatal miscalculation.
Things were not nearly so relaxed aboard the 2 American carriers. The American commander, Admiral Spruance, knew that he had to find the 1 remaining Japanese carrier and strike it before its aircraft could strike back at his ships. And then in mid-afternoon, Spruance got his chance. One of his scout planes had located the Hiryu. At 3:30, Spruance launched his dive bombers to finish the job and avenge the Yorktown.
90 minutes later, the dive bombers appeared high above the wooden flight decks of the Hiryu and began their high-speed dives heading towards the middle. In quick succession, 4 bombs smashed into the Hiryu. They penetrated the flight deck and turned the bridge into an inferno. The last remaining Japanese carrier was on fire.
Yamamoto's ambitious Midway battle plan had ended in catastrophic failure. With his carriers gone, he'd lost vital air superiority over the Americans. He still had his big gun battleships, but they were little more than white elephants in this new era where aircraft reigns supreme. Yamamoto ordered his ships back to Japan. Just over a dozen American bombs had destroyed the cream of the Imperial Japanese fleet and altered the course of the war in the Pacific.
At the Battle of Midway, America lost just over 300 men and 1 carrier, the Yorktown. Japanese losses were far more severe. Around 250 planes had been destroyed, 4 carriers had been sunk, and 3,000 men had been killed. Years of combat experience and training had been wiped out. The aircraft carrier reigned supreme, but Japan had just lost the very men it needed to wage this kind of warfare.
Japan's naval power never recovered from its defeat at Midway on June the 4th, 1942. America built a whole new fleet of aircraft carriers, but it took 3 more years of bloodshed before the Japanese surrendered here on the USS Missouri, now moored in Pearl Harbor, where the war had all begun. Japan had been a stubborn enemy, and only at last admitted defeat when America delivered the final blow. Atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which launched the world into the nuclear age. Next time, the Battle of Stalingrad. Over 60 years ago, a battle was fought in this Russian city that would be the turning point of the Second World War. It was one of the hardest fought battles of all time.
I'll be revealing what it was like for the German and Soviet soldiers who fought street by street and building by building.
And I'll be explaining how the leaders' tactics drove their own armies to the brink of destruction.
So the decks are loaded with fuel, bombs, torpedoes when the second wave of U.S. dive bombers attacks. They sink 4 carriers, 1 cruiser, 322 planes, and 3,500 men are lost. The United States at Midway loses 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 150 planes, and 307 men. It's really probably the major turning point of the war in the Pacific. Why? It halts Japanese advance. They never do take Midway Island. So this does not force the U.S. fleet back from Hawaii to San Francisco. They aren't able to have any land-based bombers that can reach Pearl Harbor. There's no Japanese fleet action for 2 years. Their losses are so great here, and this really puts Japan on the offensive. Moving on, China, Burma, India theater. So we're now in 1942. To 1945. Okay. U.S., British, Chinese, and Indians under the command of U.S. General Joseph Stilwell were really deployed to China, to Burma, to stall the Japanese advance into China and defend against the drive towards India, right? So this becomes kind of a forgotten theater of the war of the CBI, China, Burma, India, but it's very important because if the Japanese would have been able to advance farther into China, we would have lost bases in China, we would have lost a lot of stuff, and actually the bigger threat, I think, is losing India to the Japanese, because this would have, at the time, we're talking 1942, remember, been, disastrous and 43, had Rommel defeated the British at El Alamein. So all this stuff is really interconnected, right? We talked a little bit about that. Another turning point, Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal, August 42 to February 1933. Let's go to the map. If we take a look at this, if we can zoom in, here is the island of Guadalcanal, right here. Now, in and of itself, it's nothing. Okay, it's just a little tropical island. There's really nothing there. The problem is it's, again, we go to this strategic idea that it sits at a very strategic point. It's the very last island in the Solomon Islands chain. If the Japanese take it, which they do originally, and they build an airfield there, this really cuts off most of the approaches into the Coral Sea, into all the approaches to Australia. So you see, again, small island, really nothing there, but strategic value, it's hugely important. And so they, by taking it, they threaten to cut off all supply to Australia, which, let's not forget too, this is a big American base, right? Americans come in, they had troops there, they can put ships there where they can be outfitted, airplanes, etc., etc. So Australia itself is really vital to the war effort, and having it cut off by losing Guadalcanal is really going to be a big problem if that happens. So the United States really has no choice in the matter here except to do something about it, and that's what they do at Guadalcanal. So Guadalcanal is also known as Operation Watchtower. It's a first American island offensive of the war, and how it goes is essentially the Marines, U.S. Marines, 20,000 of them land on Guadalcanal in August 1942. This forces the Japanese to virtually abandon the island. They literally just skedaddle off of it, right? Because they don't want any part of these 20,000 U.S. Marines. And it looks like really an easy victory, okay? Hey, the Marines show up, the Japanese leave, and the island with the airfield is ours. It looks like that, but it turns into a 7-month battle on the island and the seas around the Solomons. U.S. fleet and transport ships come under heavy attack all the time by the Japanese. So we have something called the Battle of Savo Island, things like that. And the U.S. fleet that's there kind of guarding the Marines virtually just basically abandons them, okay? And the Japanese begin counter invasions. And it's very nasty jungle fighting in and around this airstrip, and it's all about taking this airstrip. So constant Japanese counter invasions that the U.S. Marines have to repel over and over. And again, they have no naval support, because when the Japanese Navy comes in and starts attacking all the U.S. shipping in the area, they skedaddle too. So it's really kind of a nasty, nasty battle. August 1942 to February 1943. At last, the Japanese finally give up in February 43, and it becomes really a major American victory, one that people don't really talk about anymore. But what we say is it puts the cork in the bottle of Japanese expansion, right? So here's the bottle in the bottleneck, and they're stopped right here. They're never able to cut off the approaches to Australia. Remember, these airplanes have a huge range, right? They can range all throughout here. So if the Japanese had taken and kept Guadalcanal, they could have easily cut all shipping and everything off to Australia. So it's really quite important. Secures the advances to Australia, keeps the sea lanes open, and becomes an American victory. Again, a lot of people don't talk much about it. It's not really seen as a turning point in the war, although my advisor back at Toledo would certainly say it was one. And that's it. So we see, really, with the victory at Midway as one of the major turning points here in the war in the Pacific, that we're going to see then really America, or the Allies in the Pacific, begin to go on the offensive. A little bit about Douglas MacArthur. So MacArthur, he had been commanding general of the Philippines prior to the outbreak of the war. And when the war broke out and the Japanese invaded the Philippines, MacArthur, well, how do you say it? He bugged out. He left. He actually allowed his troops there in the Philippines to be captured. And many of those who were captured in the Philippines, American troops, were forced on something called the Bataan Death March by the Japanese. Thousands of men, hundreds of men, thousands were beaten, starved to death, died on this death march, while MacArthur left the Philippines to its fate with his famous "I shall return." So MacArthur, when we begin to really start looking at this Allied offensive in the Pacific after, say, Midway and Guadalcanal, wants to really return to the Philippines. I think in many ways he wants to prove his detractors wrong. He had taken, his reputation had taken kind of a hit during the invasion of the Philippines in 1941, when he basically stayed in his bunker while all this was going on, and he earned the the moniker Dugout Doug. So MacArthur is very into this idea of going on the offensive. And what he does is, well, he, along with Chester Nimitz, proposed to Roosevelt something called the Twin Axis Strategy. Okay. Twin Axis Strategy essentially is MacArthur wanting to advance northwest up the coast of New Guinea, then onto the Philippines in order to keep his promise to return, and to also cut the Japanese lines of supply to the Dutch East Indies. So again, if we take a look at the map here, here's New Guinea. So now that we have Guadalcanal is secured, MacArthur essentially wants to start moving up this way back towards the Philippines. And he figures if he can take the Philippines, he cuts off Japanese supply to these Dutch East Indies right here. So it's a pretty solid strategy, but let's not forget, in many ways, this is feeding into MacArthur's own ego. Nimitz, for his part, wants to drive westward on a line from Pearl Harbor to the island of Formosa. So back to the map again. Here's Pearl Harbor. Here's Formosa. And essentially drive straight across. So you see, really, we kind of get this kind of concept of twin axes, all right, operating there. In many ways, this strategy will require island hopping. So essentially, you take one island, you clear it of the Japanese, you set up a base, and you move that base then to advance to the next island. So we have these kind of two competing strategies which are presented to American President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Roosevelt approves both, and that's how you get this twin axis strategy. MacArthur will be supported by a guy named the Naval Force of Admiral named William Bull Halsey, 1882 to 1959. Halsey actually was supposed to be in charge of the task force that fought at Midway Island, but at the last minute he had come down with some kind of jungle rash and was unable to do it. And so you got Spruance instead, which is actually kind of interesting. I won't go into a lot of detail. Spruance was not a carrier man. Halsey was. Spruance was actually a battleship man. He had been trained in battleships. And he was much more cautious than Halsey. And I think in some ways it's very possible that had Halsey not been sick and had been the commander at the Battle of Midway, things may have turned out a little differently. Of course, it's always hard to say so, but, you know, that's just my opinion. So, President Roosevelt approves both, and you get this twin axis strategy. Bull Halsey, his Navy will support MacArthur's Army troops as they move up their axes, and they begin moving northwest in the spring of 1943. By 44, really mid-44, they had cleared out both New Guinea and the Solomon Islands of all the Japanese forces.